I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's talk, the title of which is Moral Injury, Spiritual Wellbeing and the Australian Defence Force. And I'm very pleased that Collin Acton has been able to join us for this because he has a wealth of experience about the issue. He joined the Navy when he was 16, and his career there has been illustrious and a little bit varied. I wanted to say checkered, but it's probably better to say varied. He rose through the ranks and he was a chaplain in the Navy for 23 years. He ended up as principal chaplain and Director General of Chaplaincy. So I'm going to leave him to add the details because the details are in fact extremely interesting.
Well, thank you, Jenny. And it has been an interesting career spanning a number of decades. I've got to say, since 1979, I should have added up or taken away 2024, whatever we are in 24 now from 1979. It's been some time. And in that time, Australia as we know it, and most of us be well aware of it, Australia has certainly changed a lot in every possible way almost. The Navy I joined in 1979 is almost unrecognisable from the Navy I left at the end of 2020. The young Australians joining the ADF are almost a different species of human than the ones that I joined with in 1979. They certainly have a very different way of planning, doing their lives, certainly have very different relationships with their parents, their peers, their friend networks, even friend networks today. This generation growing up with, mobile phones and tablets. What are they calling them? The A generation or whatever it is, but kids who've never known what it is not to have an iPad in front of them and who've been connected with people all around the world. I remember my kids at home having friends in the US and Britain, and they played games with them and they considered them good friends and they spent a lot of time with them. So it's a different way of doing friends. But this group have also a very different set of expectations about their employer. And that is a fascinating thing, particularly as the ADF struggles to recruit and retain its workforce. And the ADF's an unusual employer. It takes people without any qualifications and it trains them. So, I joined as a young 16-year-old and went to HMAS Maroubra out at Quakers Hill in the western suburbs of Sydney and did an apprenticeship as a fitter machinist. We're still doing that kind of thing today. We're still training people to do those kind of mechanical and electrical and electronic and a whole range of other things. So you think about electronic warfare, you think about people who can, manage enormous quantities of data and be able to present that to the decision makers on a ship in an operations room. Really, really important stuff. So we take people without any of those qualifications. We spend a huge amount of time and money training people. And the Navy is probably, the most critical in this respect because everybody on board has a sort of technical bent. Even the bosun's mate who look after the small, arms and weapon systems and things like that need a great deal of experience to be able to do the seamanship side of things. So a lot of training, a lot of money. Army's probably less so, but I'm sure it takes a huge amount of expense to train up a soldier to be an infantry soldier or to be a cavalry soldier and also to do all the maintenance and all that sort of stuff. And Air Force are just working on really high technology stuff. So very, very expensive workforce to train and you just don't want to hemorrhage your workforce. And unfortunately, for probably the last 10 or 15 years, the ADF has been hemorrhaging people. Now, it's interesting as you think about why that's the case. I'm sure there's lots of reasons, but I think a really big part of the problem is that the management of the ADF is largely people who grew up in the 80s. They're now in their 50s, and there's a massive gap between these people, their expectations, what they understand the workforce to be, and that group of young people entering the workforce today. And that gap exists in a whole range of areas, but I guess the area that I'm most interested in and one in which I've been banging on about for a long time, is this group of young Australians have a very different understanding of and appreciation of the role of organised religion in their lives. I'm just going to pop a couple of slides up now. So what you're looking at is, and some of you may have seen this before, it's just looking at the declining religious adherence in the Australian Defence Force. So we go back to 2003, across the workforce, approximately 70% of the workforce would have ticked the box and said, in some way, I'm religious. I'm an Anglican, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Presbyterian or a Baptist. And over the last 2 decades, that number has been steadily declining. And what's interesting is from the census data, which is should be released officially shortly, there's been an 8% drop in just 4 years. So it's dropping fast at around 2% per year. So as I say, for young people back when I joined, everyone was either something. I mean, my parents didn't go to church, but I ticked the Anglican box or Church of England box, I think it was. I turned up to chapel for the first 4 or 5 weeks at HMAS Marimba and never went near the place again whilst I was there. But there was that sort of thing in the background that, somehow I'm C of E. There were chaplains in the Defence Force back in those days, not as many as today, which is interesting. And their primary role was delivering religious ministry. They did church services. They turned up at parades and delivered prayers. And during my time at Marimba, they turned up, I think, once a fortnight or once a week and delivered religious instruction. I don't remember much about that. I remember apparently Moses was riding across the desert in his Harley Davidson. So I'm not sure how effective or useful the instruction was, but I certainly didn't learn very much from it. What's really interesting and what's driving those numbers, if you have a look, this graph might be a little difficult to decipher. Can you see on one side it says E, and on the other side, the right-hand side, it says O. So you've got enlisted personnel and you've got officers, two cohorts. It starts with low numbers and they get higher. The higher the number, the higher the rank. So on the officer side of the house, O10, we're talking generals. If you look at O1, we're talking sub-lieutenants and lieutenants. That's so very brand new members of the ADF. And on the enlisted side of the house, you're looking at privates or seamen or, that's your entry level. And it's interesting. So the higher you go in the rank structure, the greater the adherence to religion. It's fascinating. If you look at those numbers of those just joining, it's actually sitting below 20% at ticking the religion box. And if you look over at the decision makers, all the way over on the right hand of both those boxes, the E9, 10 and the 07 to 10s, we're looking at greater than 70%, 80% of those folks think that religion is a good thing and it should be there. And I've had interesting conversation with the Chief of Navy where I was saying we actually need to do something about this. And he would say, but I remember the padres at HMAS Creswell, they were great. They took us away on character guidance courses and we had a fantastic time. I said, young people aren't thinking like that anymore. So now he was reluctant to do anything. And very fortunately, the Deputy Chief of Navy, Mick Noonan, was willing to do something. And that's where change came for Navy. But as I say, it's a very, very different kettle of fish today than what it was. But the problem is the decision makers still see great value in religion and are reluctant to do anything about it. I guess we see that in Parliament too. There's a cohort of parliamentarians that see great value in religion and protecting it and this religious discrimination kerfuffle that's going on. They want to protect something, whereas the majority of Australians really couldn't care less about religion. And I'm not saying that young Australians are rude and arrogant towards chaplain. They're respectful. G'day, sir. How you doing? But they would just be reluctant to seek you out and seek support. That's a real concern, especially when we get down to areas where people are being harmed. And, I've got to say, tonight's about moral injury, and moral injury is not just something that occurs in the Australian Defence Force or any other defence force. there can be violations of, my sense of what is right and wrong in any occupation. But for tonight, we're just thinking about how that applies in defence and what defence is doing to address the problem. But it's important to think about moral injury in the context of normal moral emotions. It's a continuum of moral distress. So on the one hand, you're slightly troubled by something that's happened, and on the extreme end, people are injured and experience ongoing effects. Now, all of us, as I say, has experienced some moral distress, from being morally affronted, being part of something which has caused harm to another, and somehow you feel guilt or shame out of that. Most of us have experienced that. Most of us experience the inner conflict of having to make a decision and knowing that whichever way you go, it's going to cause harm. That could be considered some kind of moral distress. It's a kind of dissonance, a moral dissonance. And for some, as I say, there are lasting, ongoing effects. Now, there's a range of definitions. One of the important things that, moral injury is not settled science. It's something which is still, subject of a lot of thought and research. But there's a range of definitions for moral injury. But it's also interesting that there are only a few that are really empirically validated, and even fewer that have been informed by veterans and others with their lived experience of moral injury. So lots of researchers, academics, chaplains saying what it is, and not a lot of conversation about what people who've experienced it are actually going through. There's a range of clinical and non-clinical models. This is about as technical as this talk's going to get, folks. It's only going to last for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to back off a little. But there's a range of clinical and non-clinical models that have been proposed to explain moral injury. And clinical models focus on the psychiatric symptoms. And the non-clinical models really look at the social, the spiritual, and the political dimensions of moral injury. The utility of any model needs to be judged on the extent to which it informs an appropriate, a useful intervention. And overall, and this is folks who've looked at a lot of the models, they indicate that moral injury has a biological, a psychological, a social, and a spiritual component. So it's a psycho-socio-spiritual issue. And it requires attention in all those different areas in order for the individual to recover. And when I'm using that word spiritual, we'll get into that in a little while, because I think that's fascinating, and it's fascinating why religious chaplains said that they have such a large role in that. The emerging evidence indicates that clinically, moral injury is a mental health issue. It's independent of PTSD and depression, and it does contribute uniquely to the risk of suicide. And overall, there's a strong, complex relationship between moral injury, depression, PTSD, and suicidality in the military populations. I'll just share screen again and it'll just make sense of what I've just said, hopefully. So in this slide, I'm hoping that you can see moral injury and the domains. So, and this is where it differs from PTSD. PTSD is really a fear-based matter problem, whereas moral injury is more of guilt and shame and disgust, those kinds of emotions. It has effects on the individual, so the individual can feel like they're a bad person, they're unworthy, they're unforgivable. And I think that's where, if you think about it, religions claims to have a lot to say about good and bad and guilt and shame and how to solve that problem. It has effects in the interpersonal domain. So, loss of faith, loss of trust in people can be a big part of what moral injury is or claims to be. And there's those other parts. And spiritual or religious, basically you've got these, the big questions of life, those beliefs which you've held dearly are shattered about morality and humanity. And there's some literature that's been made available to defence people. Now, I haven't got a copy of this. I've only been able to get a couple of screenshots of these documents, but this was from late last year, so I'm just not sure we're up to in rolling this out. But these little handbooks are very popular in the United States. I suspect this has come out of the United States and it's just been Australianised. But can you read that? Is that clear? Can people read that? It'll be important for the last slide. So, they're the kind of things that they've ascertained that military people can struggle with. So, following orders that, may be illegal or immoral, knowingly or accidentally causing the death of civilians in combat. I guess that's a big one from Afghanistan. Giving orders that result in the injury or death of a fellow service member or civilian. So they're all pretty severe things. So it's not just limited to military people, police, emergency service personnel, doctors, nurses in hospitals could also find themselves in situations. Any of us could find ourselves in situations where, we're involved in something which results in harm to another, and we may have these feelings. Well, what is moral injury? Just going to touch on a couple of the models, and this book helpfully picks up on two of the most useful models. So probably the most influential model, and people these books are readily available in any bookshop. Brett Litz and others have written extensively on the field, so he's extended what PTSD is. And I guess, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a thought that moral injury was just an extension of something that came out of PTSD or was similar to, and there are some similarities, certainly. But PTSD is based on fear, whereas I say the moral injury is really based on guilt and shame. Now, for Litz, it's about a transgressive act that someone's done something. So they've acted in a way that's caused harm to another, or they've failed to act to stop harm to another. So in some way, the person feels responsible for a bad outcome, a grievous outcome for another person. And I guess that becomes an issue when that person starts to see it in terms of a global, internal and stable situation of attribution theory that, I did this, therefore I must be a bad person, I must be unworthy, I'm unforgivable. And those things begin digging a hole, and the person is in a pretty bad state pretty quickly. So that's on the one hand. You can see that that transgressive model in that first paragraph. What is moral injury? Moral injury, sorry. It's failing to prevent or doing something that causes harm to another. Jonathan Shea is another psychiatrist, academic, and his research comes out of his work with Vietnam veterans. So that goes back some way. And Shea will go on to say, and I think it's there, the quick fact, that that term moral injury, whilst it's been coined by Shea, has certainly been written about for more than 3,000 years. And if you get a hold of Shea's book, it's really worth a read. He goes back into Gilead and Odyssey, Homer and Hector and all those sorts of guys, and can see the components of moral injury in those characters. And for him, it's not so much about transgressive acts. I did something that caused harm, or I failed to do something which resulted in harm to another. It's about being let down, about being betrayed by the leadership, whether it's the military leadership or the political leadership. It's that sense that I have been terribly hurt and betrayed by those in authority. And for Shea, that's at the heart of a moral injury. Now, there are two different ways of looking at the same thing, I think, and in terms of treatment, both will have very similar ways of actually dealing with that. There's a number of other models. I won't go into those, but they basically take parts of Shea and Litz, and once again, they all kind of agree that there's this biological, social, and spiritual framework that can actually be used to support people who are morally injured. And they recognise interestingly, a number of them recognise the religious and spiritual domains in moral injury. And for psychiatry, this is a fairly first time, I guess, that a mental health issue has expanded beyond the biopsychosocial realm to include the spiritual and religious elements. And a lot of the information that I've been reading says there's a lot of work still needs to be done to understand how to integrate that, the spiritual and religious domains of moral injury, and how to incorporate those into the clinical context. Interestingly, a lot of the research has come out of the US, and as you can imagine, the US are far more religiously sort of tuned into nation than Australia. And I think I read somewhere that something like 40% of the US military population are regularly involved in religious activities, whether that's going to church or other kinds of rituals. The same is not true for Australia. So at the moment, I think 34% of Australians tick the Christian box and about 3% tick other religions. But I would say of the Christian, most of them would be nominal because it's that biased question, same one that's in the census. So a large portion of them would be nominal, a small portion, whether it's 17, 20, 12, who knows, but a small portion of them would be religiously committed, I would expect. But for them, the researchers are talking about this spiritual subtype involve high levels of struggle with, where is God in this terrible situation? God has left me, God has let me down. What is God trying to tell me? And as I say, in the Australian context, I think remarkably few Australians will be asking that question. It's worthwhile, we understand, I hope, what religion is, but spirituality's got a bit of a checkered past. In 10 years, the ADF Chaplaincy branch has come a long way to recognising spirituality and actually taking a hold of it and wanting to own it. 10 years ago, it was eschewed and not given much credence at all because it was a fuzzy concept and very difficult to define. One of the things now, I was in a role in Joint Health Command where I got to do some defining of terms, and we tracked down a definition of spirituality, and it's Christina Pachowski. So she's the director of the George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health, and this definition comes out of a lot of work in Europe and America. There are a number of conferences, hard to believe, but that's how it sort of came to be. And this definition defines spirituality as the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. And I'll say a couple of things about that definition, because that definition doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be a theist. That definition of spirituality says to me that, it's about meaning and purpose. Those things can be basically, any humanist would say they have great meaning and purpose in what they do. And connection, well, connection to the moment, to self, to others, to nature. I think those things are fairly relevant. One doesn't need a theological degree to assist someone work through spiritual matters if this is the definition. This was the definition of spirituality. I think it still is in the Australian Defence Force. I don't know if things have changed in the last 3 years, but that was the definition we were working with. And I think that's important as we consider the assistance we provide to those who are struggling with moral injury, particularly as Chaplaincy is aligning itself as an agency that can provide support, pastoral support to those with a moral injury. Interesting as we think about spirituality too. Anna Halaloff she spoke at the conference in November. She's an amazing lady. Her and a number of other researchers did an extraordinary piece looking at the the worldviews, the attitudes of young Australians aged 13 to 18. I think this was about 2016, so it really came out of the national census, trying to understand what the data was saying. And that produced some really interesting results. And the graph that you see before you, basically there's six. They've got six different. I think Anna went into this at the conference too, from memory. But what I find fascinating is, the large portion of young people, and this correlates to what we see with young people entering the Australian Defence Force. So this worldly would be those who don't believe in any spiritual dimension. Thank you very much. I mean, they might have a sense of connection with nature, but when it comes to spooky stuff or spirits or anything like that, it's just not on the agenda. That's a large chunk. Those who are indifferent, another large chunk. The spiritual but not religious and the seekers, that's a pretty large chunk too. And they're not necessarily interested in the traditional religious forms of answers to those sorts of existential questions either. They can be people who are looking into old kind of religions, and I think just the recent data, I don't know if it's actually come out officially, but for defence, I think there's about 0.3% of the ADF population are listing themselves as pagans. That's a pretty large number. So, spiritual but not religious, they might find themselves there. Seekers who are interested, looking. And when you have a look at that group that are nominally religious or religiously committed, it's just a tiny chunk of young people. So, given that's where spirituality lies, that there's a difference between someone with a formed traditional religious worldview and this other large chunk of young people who have a very, very different view of the world, you kind of have to ask the question, what role for ADF chaplains? Now, I'll just turn this off. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. I'll stop share. With the need for this. So what role for ADF chaplains? So I get there's some great chaplains out there, there's no doubt about that. There's lots of good, well-intentioned chaplains who, I would have no problems with young people going along and having a chat to, because they are good humans. They would be, in my view, humanists in the same way that I was a humanist, I think, for a long time. My Christian humanist, those Christian wheels started falling off 10 years ago, and they're well and truly gone now. But I regard myself as a good human, someone who can sit down and engage thoughtfully with another person, put them at the centre of the conversation, and hear their story, and help them work through what it is they're doing or what they're going through. I know there's a lot of chaplains out there who do that. So this is not being critical of chaplains. It's not being critical of having religious chaplains who have a firm theological foundation. From that previous life, there's still a portion of the workforce for whom religion's important. And I think we should cater for them. I really do. But as I say, there's a large number of ADF personnel who are not religious. And one of the issues that come up for me as I think about religious chaplains, and it came out recently at the Royal Commission, that there were some chaplains who have unhelpful theological views when it comes to a range of things, whether it's LGBT, whether it's the role and place of women. One of the things we were confronted with at the Defence Member and Family Helpline with, this is only very recent, maybe a year and a half ago, was chaplains who were encouraging women to stay in abusive relationships. Why? Because of the sanctity of marriage. Very unhelpful. I shouldn't say too much about that because my boss told me not to say anything about it at the time, so I won't. But it's a problem. And also, if you've got a theological worldview, there's the issue of human beings are not just broken, but they're dead in sin and transgression. The only way they can really recover and be brought back to full life is through a relationship with Jesus. And for many chaplains, that's what they believe. And they've been trained that way. That's what they've received in theological college and formation. That's how they think. So it's no surprise that some chaplains will be pushing some of our workforce to receive Christ that's their solution for a moral injury. That's a problem. Now, chaplains will claim that this is within the realm of pastoral care. That's great. And if you're doing pastoral care with a religious person of your faith, no problem at all. But if it's someone who's not a person of faith, someone who's non-religious, or someone from another religious adherence, could be a Muslim, a Hindu, or Jew, or something like that, it would be inappropriate to push them to receive the Christian faith. Now, chaplains, as they've been working pretty hard to kind of cement themselves in this role in providing support in this domain of moral injury. And once again, this is moving away from that criticism of some chaplains. Timothy Hodson, I don't know if that's a name that's ringing any bells. He did a PhD in pastoral narrative disclosure, and it is actually a pretty useful model of working with somebody as a pastoral carer. And it's an interesting model because it doesn't really. Anyway, I'll pop it up on the board, and we can have a look together. Oops. There we go. So, this is the 8 stages of the pastoral narrative disclosure, and there's nothing in this model that really requires an individual to have a theological or religious foundation to work with somebody. And yet chaplains, a friend who was at one of these things, one of the chaplains leading it, gave a passionate plea that only chaplains can deliver this, that you need to have this spiritual and theological foundation to provide for the well-being of ADF personnel. And, at one level, I'm just thinking absolute rubbish. Developing rapport, developing that trusted relationship, reflecting on the experience from review. I mean, you work your way through that. And that's something that any compassionate, caring, thoughtful, human service person could do. Nothing unusual there. But the interesting thing is, look, once again, I think Timothy Hodson is an outstanding individual and has developed this model. And chaplains are really using this, and all power to them. And I think, look, if they can reach out and help others without sort of straying into that lane of being the Christian evangelist, then we have no problems. But on the other hand, a lot of young people don't want to go and talk to the chaplain too. So I'm going to move to a place where I'm saying we actually really need to have diversity within chaplains in defence. Religious chaplains, by all means, but we also need the non-religious ones too. As I say, there's no compelling reason why the pastoral carer needs to be religious or a chaplain to deliver this. Now, in the ADF, all of the ADF chaplains have done the training to do this. So it's something that we've taken pretty seriously. And, if you've got a non-religious pastoral carer working with somebody and they have, where is God in all this, then after ascertaining God they're talking about, I'll refer them to the appropriate religious professional. As we've noted, when 80% of the young Australians joining the ADF have no religious affiliation, pretty unlikely that they're going to have that where is God in all this going on for them. There's some concern, particularly with the way in which this strategy has been implemented. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I do have some concerns. And that is, recently at the Australasian Military Medicine Association, they have a conference every year. The conference over in Perth was attended by the Directorate of Spiritual Wellbeing, and that's led by the chap kneeling down in the uniform. And I've got to say, Dan is a great guy. I've got a lot of respect for him. He would probably dislike me immensely coming out as an atheist, but that's okay. I can live with that. But Dan himself is a good man. The concerns I have with this picture and the group of people that went across with him, and they basically spoke at the conference about this pastoral narrative disclosure program and what chaplains were doing, is behind him, just behind him, there's a bishop. That's Grant Dibden. He's the one that stated openly that he became the bishop, the Anglican Defence Force bishop, that he wanted to recruit chaplains who make disciples. He said openly on a number of occasions, occasions that, in his view, ADF chaplains were missionaries, bringing the good news of Jesus to the troops that don't know him yet. In that photo, you've also got two other people who are on his board, and they will no doubt share a similar view. So, large portion, once again, I wasn't there, I didn't hear any of them speak, but it's of concern that you have a very conservative evangelical influence in that group, for whom, seeing people turn to Jesus is the most important thing. And I think that's a problem. And it's a problem that Defence need to do something about. Now, I understand Defence have recently made some changes to RACs, but it'll be interesting to see how that works its way out. This guy still has pretty much immediate access to all the service chiefs and the CDF, service chiefs, Army, Navy and Air Force, and the Chief of Defence Force. And these are all the guys who think religion is fairly important. So they would give him a hearing, and I think that's a problem. So next year, I don't know if that group, Dan's moved on, he's got another job, but there's an inaugural moral injury and wellbeing conference in Brisbane. That's in mid this year. The keynote speaker is a bloke called Harold Koenig. I don't know if that's a person you've heard much of. So he's a researcher, academic, a psychiatrist, American, and he's done a fair bit of work in the moral injury role. He's also published a pretty lengthy tome on religion and health. And it's interesting, he makes a claim after all of his research that religion has a profoundly positive effect in every area, from depression, anxiety, you name it, has a positive effect. The only negative effect of being religious is they tend to be a little heavier, a little more weighty. So he also receives some fairly hefty funding from the Templeton Foundation. The Templeton Foundation is in it to basically promote, support evangelical Christianity in the States. He's a keynote speaker at the conference. I think that there are questions there. So, sharing again. So, religious chaplaincy and an increasingly non-religious ADF. Like I say, if the ADF was staffed by a religiously committed workforce, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but it's not. If it was staffed by a large portion of people who are religious, employing religious ministers as chaplains, it wouldn't be a problem. However, the ADF workforce of the day we've seen is by and large pretty indifferent to religion, couldn't care less really about it. And yet, when you look at the ADF chaplaincy workforce, there's 150 of them. 140 of them are all Christian ministers, Catholic priests, Anglican ministers, Pentecostal pastors. So it's a really, really unhelpful mix, I think. Navy have a handful of what we call maritime spiritual wellbeing officers. I still cringe every time I say that. The word spiritual's in there to help a bunch of chaplains accept it, not thinking about what the workforce might think about it. So, if I could go back in time, I'd probably wish I could have fought maybe to call it something else, just a wellbeing support officer or something like that. But unfortunately, the word spiritual's in there, and I think that's unhelpful for a portion of our workforce. And when you think about it, and I know this is the case because I worked at the helpline and I was supportive of defence chaplaincy on the helpline when I worked there. I would encourage people to reach out and speak. If they needed to talk, I'd say, look, unit padre, why don't you go chat to the unit padre? I lost count of the number of times people went, I don't want to speak to the chaplain, I'm not religious. And we went into this, all of us, I could hear people doing it all the time. Oh, the padre is not going to do religion to you. They're just a good person who'll sit and listen. And sometimes they went, all right. And other times they went, actually, no, I don't really want to. A good friend of mine is a psychologist with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and she regularly tries to encourage people to seek help in their unit with their padre. A number of people just don't want to do that. What's really interesting in when the MSWO, the Maritime Spiritual Wellbeing Officer proposal went through, had to be a court case, so we could actually pay them. And part of that was in 2 years, Navy had to present a report to say how they were going. That report is really interesting. Some disturbing aspects. Some of the religious chaplains saw it as their personal mission to make sure the non-religious EMSFOs were going to fail. So they experienced some challenges from religious chaplains. Who would have thought? But on the other side, there was some really interesting comments. They were in great demand. And one of the religious chaplains said that he thought they were really popular because of the perception that they had no religious baggage. It's really important. So for lots of our workforce, seeing someone who has no religious baggage is important. I think I made the point on several occasions, or I have tried to make this point, that the chaplain role is very different from any other role. Defence senior leaders used to say, oh, chaplains are but one support mechanism. They've got all these other ones. Well, to go and see a social worker in defence, good luck. If you reckon you can get in there in 3 days, you're doing well. You need to ring the helpline. They then make an intake to a social worker. If there's a social worker available, they'll give the member a call and organise a meeting. That could be 2 or 3 or 4 days down the track. Go see medical, go see a psychologist. Look, unless you're talking about, suicidality, or unless you're talking about something really, really critical and serious, you're probably going to find yourself booking an appointment for next week. So good luck getting support right away. If you want to see the Padre, guess what? They'll come around to your house that evening, or they'll meet up with you that afternoon. They're available 24/7. No other support services. Social workers aren't available after work hours, 4:30 on Friday afternoon. Good luck finding a social worker. And it's not because they don't care. They're just not allowed to do that. Whereas chaplains can see a person anytime over the 7 days. It's a very different kind of support. And when they're all religious chaplains and all Christians in the Army, Air Force, I think now actually have a Muslim, Navy, we brought in an Islamic chaplain, we brought in a Buddhist and Hindu. So there's a little bit of differentiation, and we also brought in a non-religious. So it gives people some options. And for the largest course of our workforce, it's great having those other religious faiths, but when only 3% of the ADF religions other than Christianity, and the majority are non-religious, it's important to have that option for people to reach out and seek that immediate support from a person in uniform who understands their situation from the inside. I think that's really important. And you think about some of that religious baggage, and it's huge. You think about all the scandals that have hit the church over the last 20 years, not even 20 years, 10 years. Brian Houston and Hillsong, financial and sexual challenges there. The Royal Commission, institutional abuse, and all the terrible stuff that's come out across all of the churches, not just the Catholic, but all the churches suffered the same thing. The church's opposition to same-sex marriage, its opposition to, women in positions of leadership in church. Sydney Anglicans had this terrible problem with domestic abuse, for goodness sake, and that comes directly out of its theology of complementarianism. Women are equal but different. Men lead, women make cakes, that sort of philosophy. And church's position on a whole range of other things, from climate change to who knows what else. Young people looking at it and thinking, what rubbish, and suddenly, when they join the ABF, they discover that that's their support person. That's the most available person they can go to for help. So when they're struggling, having been let down awfully by ADF leadership on some matter, or they've found themselves in a situation where they've done something on operation or an exercise where they suddenly feel guilt and shame, the last person they're going to want to go and speak to is a religious chaplain. Now, I know religious chaplains have been doing some work on this and saying, well, actually, that's not true. They love us. But there's some really interesting stuff being produced by chaplains that is verging on academic misconduct in the way they've mistreated data to present their case. Coming down on the side of, look, no problems with religious chaplains. For a portion of our workforce, important, but for the large chunk of our workforce, the ADF really needs to shift to having a different kind of pastoral care arrangement. And, I think what Navy have done has opened up the door. Air Force are looking at this. I hope they have a look at what Navy have done. It'd be stupid to have another strain of non-religious pastoral support. Yes, I know that in Air Force there's a view that a social worker can't understand or work with someone on spiritual matters, which I find difficult to get my head around. But anyway, that's where I'm at the moment. Really wanting to promote, support, and see real change across the three services. It's not just Air Force chaplains that have done awful things and whose theological views are in direct opposition to ADF values. It's in the three services actually there. I've seen horrible examples in all three services. Counterbalanced with some good people too. So don't hear me saying they're all bad. There's some great chaplains out there. That's me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Just to finish, Kathy's raised an interesting point about the degree of moral injury or distress. Probably it's more appropriate to call it moral distress that we all experience when things are done in our name, such as the treatment or lack of it with respect to refugees and issues like that. And I suppose we could also expand that to the way in which many Indigenous issues are handled or denied or ignored. And so on, and the list could go on. So it's a conversation we need to keep having, but this has been a wonderful opportunity to both hear about, to have some insight, as I said earlier, into the Defence Force and how it operates, and the issues that are coming out and are undergoing change and a degree of transformation. I think there were many hopeful notes that you injected into the conversation, Collin, so that is good, but we all need to stay aware and keep discussing the issues as they arise. So yes. So Kathy's just posted how much she's appreciated the talk tonight, but I'd like everyone, yes, to just join with me. It's always very hard on Zoom to kind of quite carry this off, but to express your appreciation to Collin for his time and his openness about so many things that he's experienced. So thank you once again, Collin.
No, thank you. It's been my pleasure.